Hello friends, welcome to Tarun IAS. Today we will be discussing editorial from The Hindu of 15th of December 2022. So let's start with the editorial. You can relate it with your General Studies paper 1, Population and Associated Issues, and General Studies paper 2, that is government policies, their implications, the design and its implication. The title of editorial is Census as Mirror of Past and Present. Now let us see what the editorial has to say. This editorial has been written by Pulapri Balakrishna, who teaches at Ashoka University, Sonipat. Now, census, which is an exercise that basically counts the population of the nation under several parameters. Therefore, census is an important exercise when we speak of the policy making. And there are other related activities that governs the functioning of the country and the governance overall. So recently what has happened, there has been a study which is done by Dylan Sullivan and Jason Hickel on India's experience under the colonial rule, and they basically collected the census data to reveal that between 1880 and 1920 approximately 100 million of Indians they had died due to the British policy in India. Now, when we study modern history, and the major portion of the modern history is dedicated to the the struggle for the national struggle for the Indian freedom, for the freedom of the country, then we also study under one section the impact of the British colonial rule. And in that impact of the British colonial rule, you would be studying about the famines that took place in India. And one of the major famines that took place in India was in 1943, and before that too famines did took place they did take place during the British colonial rule. So basically, considering the census data between 1880 and 1920, they had concluded the India's experience under the colonial rule. So their basic methodology relied on calculating the excess of mortality. Now, what is this mortality? It is basically the difference between the actual death and the deaths that may be expected. Now, what are these two things? Actual deaths are the number that have been recorded as per the census, and expected death, they are the number of deaths that can result because of some malfunctioning, because of poor governance or misgovernance, due to some criminal laws, etc., etc. So expected death. While the census data for actual while they have used the census data for the actual death, the two scientists, population scientists Dylan Sullivan and Jason Hickel, they arrived that the death which is to be expected using two alternatives, they had arrived at the death to be expected. Okay, so let me discuss their methodology here. So their method is basically that they speak of two types of death: the actual death. So there is actual death and there is expected death. All right. So this actual death has been calculated by using census data, and this expected death has been calculated by using two alternative benchmarks. Expected death, the first one is the mortality rate in India for 1880, and the second alternative is the mortality rate for England in 16th and 17th century. Is that clear? So this is their methodology was. Now, the assumption in their choice, that means using letter as a benchmark, is that before colonial rule. Now, what they have assumed, because in scientific study, whenever we have to arrive at a conclusion, we consider a hypothesis, and side by side we do consider some assumptions as well. So what assumptions did these two people consider? The first one is that their assumption is that the death which resulted, the mortality rate in India and in the contemporary England, they were not very different. they are saying that it is unlikely to have been very different from that of the contemporary England. So, therefore, their result estimated that excess death which occurred during 1880 and 1920, they are approximately the 50 million in the first case and 160 million in the second one, respectively. Right. Now, this is about their methodology and their assumption. Now, according to the according to the writer, the authors, they have settled on a midway figure that is approximately 100 million for deaths which were caused in India due to the colonial policy. Now, according to their perspective, they pointed out that this figure is greater than the death which occurred from famine in Soviet Union, in Maoist China, in North Korea, in Pol Pot's Cambodia. These are all those countries where there was dictatorship. There was there was dictatorship. So, because of the dictatorship, it provides a direct assessment of the consequences of the British Raj for India. Now, the attempts to quantify the impact of colonial rule. Now, generally, when we study modern history, we've been trying to not assess the impact of colonial rule in terms of the quality, that there was lot of degradation of the environment, a deforestation process was there for the railway sleepers. There was the British policies of such as the Forest Act was there, and also the revenue settlement policies, etc. All these, they, that there was a qualitative assessment that we study, but this basically attempts to quantify the impact. And generally, the quantification of the impact of colonial rule, it is in the change in the national income. But if we consider the reliability of the data for the 19th century, then it is almost non-existent. That means we do not find reliable data with respect to the national income in 19th century. The population figures are of course available in 1971 because in 1971 the first population census was conducted during the British colonial rule. And if we consider the Sullivan and Hickel study, then they basically took the age-wise population distribution in the census to estimate the mortality rate, and through that they drew their conclusion about the evolution of the economic conditions in the colonial India. So their figures for the excess of the death, that is of course only as good as the benchmark chosen. And what was the benchmark that they had chosen? It was the England. It was the mortality rate in England in the period between 16 to 17th. The mortality rate itself is the result of the estimation and not of the enumeration. So these are two different words. Estimation is something that we arrive after a mathematical calculation, and enumeration is basically a exercise which is similar to the census. That means enumerating, that means you are basically stepwise, you are trying to count it. For the registration of births and deaths, it became established practice in India only much later on. Right. So gradually, this exercise of counting the numbers via this scheme of census, it developed gradually in India, with first census being conducted in the year 1871 during the British colonial rule. If we subject the Sullivan-Hickel study to these caveats, then what is the conclusion that have been drawn, which are not so widely recognized, is that the mortality rate in British India is seen to rise steadily after 1881, there was a record increase of close to 20% by 1921. So what the writer is trying to say, that the mortality rate in British India is started to steadily rise, and the unusual rate of the mortality in the country due to the natural causes is not feasible. Like, if there is a steady rise in the mortality rate of a country, then all this cannot be due to the natural causes. There cannot be one cause for this. There should be, or there has to be multiple causes for this. So, if there is a steady rise in the mortality rate according to the study, then this suggests that the living conditions of the people during the British period started to worsen. The mortality rate started to dip in the year 1931, which was the last census to be conducted in the British India. So, if we consider the first census, that is 1871, to the last census that was conducted in 1931, then there was a steady rise, and then it dipped in the year 1931, which was the last census. However, shockingly, 1943 is that year where the famine took place, and in the last 5 years of the close to the 2 centuries of the British colonial rule. And this is almost the most studied famine in India. You must have heard about Professor PC Mahalanobis, who pioneered the census studies, or this analytical, a mathematical enumeration of the people, etc. And there was a study conducted in the Bengal by PC Mahalanobis, who also pioneered the establishment of the National Statistical Commission, which is now known as the National Statistical Commission, and NSO, that is National Statistical Organization. And he also used to uh, publish a journal by the name I have a confusion here. Then that is, it was by the name Samkhya or Biometrica. I have confusion between these two names. So, Professor PC Mahalanobis, he pioneered study of famines in Bengal, and it was in 1943 that a worst famine took place in Bengal, and it was more or less because of the British policies, especially during the World War II. So the British argument for the empire, including that the British forms of their policies, including the English language, the banking system, the common law, the Protestantism, the tea import, etc., and the limited state representative assemblies, and the idea of liberty, etc., they all have been advanced by the Harvard historian Niall Ferguson. These are the positive aspects that have been highlighted by the historian Niall Ferguson. But in this statement, there is no mention of the famines, which almost started at the onset of the rule by the East India Company in Bengal, which started to succeed with deindustrialization. There was a drain of wealth, which have been very well documented by the national economists such as Dadabhai Nauroji. We have we have Romesh Chandra Datta. We have several other economists who very well documented the impact, especially the economic impact of the British colonial rule in India, the worsening food crisis, and in fact, the worsening food security was the major reason for the famine that took place in the year 1943. The worsening condition of the peasantry. There was a growing commercialization of the agriculture, the revenue settlement policies that the Britishers and the British administrators they had employed in India, which worsened the condition not only of the peasants, but also of the tillers, and it also impacted to certain extent zamindars as well, because there was no hereditary rule. Whoever could not pay to the revenue, their land was basically taken away. So if we analyze all these developments that took place in the British colonial rule, then these developments are definitely, they have been documented, they have been analyzed by the economic historians of our country. And if we draw our attention to this sustained rise that have been studied by the Sullivan and Hickel study, then basically it sort of vindicates the Dadabhai Nauroji's claim of the immiseration of India under the British rule. India under the British rule, and the belief that the British policy in India, it caused the repeated famines, is also bolstered by the fact that there has not been a single famine since 1947. Now, if we look at our situation, then since 1947, when India gained independence, India has not experienced famines that took place especially during the British colonial rule. And since 1947, India has gradually achieved sustainability and self sufficiency in terms of the food grain production, and there has been a sharp decline in the death rate. However, the writer points towards irony also, and the first irony is this: that though the life expectancy has increased, that though the expectancy has increased, and there has been a gradual increase in the rate of birth and a gradual decline in the death rate, there have been serious consequences of this rising population. And the one fact that writer points towards is that this population, it acts as a double-edged sword. And the first very consequences of the rising population that writer draws our attention towards is the gender inequality. And if we look at the conditions of the gender inequality, then it has progressively worsened. It currently stands at 943, if I am not wrong, and it varies from region to region. And according to the economic census, it has in fact increased in the year 2021. So this is the first fact that writer points towards. And writer also talks about that how the population of a country basically acts as a mirror for the future. Therefore, the census exercise becomes of utmost significance, and it is highly imperative for any nation to conduct a census with utmost transparency and and clear governance. So there is another indication that the writer points towards with respect to the gender ratio, is that the ratio of females to male in the population. It is believed that if we, in the absence of this factor, there is a lower life chances for the women. Now there are two things that we need to understand. First is the life choices, and second is the life chances, right? So what do we mean by life chances and life choices? See, basically, the right to life under article 21, it's not just about the sustainable life. It is also about the dignity, life with dignity. So when we speak of the life choices, we are speaking about the individual liberty to think, to express, to educate oneself, to have a personal development, etc., etc. So life choices implies about the personal dignity and the liberty of the person. When we speak of the life chances, then it depends upon the socio-economic condition of a person. So life chances for a woman, they are particularly limited in country which experiences high, not only the income inequality but also the gender inequality. And there are of course the regional differences with respect to this. So, the disturbing trend, which started in the year 1947, and it has seen a continuous decline for 4 decades. If we speak of the year 1951, then it started to inch up in the year 1991. However, in the year 11, it was yet lower than it was expected to be in the year 1951. So, even though the life expectancy has increased soon after independence, in the early years, at least, it has increased faster for men than it did for women. So therefore, when India became free from the foreign rule, and some of the Indians, according to the writer, they grew more free than the others. And as India chants the Vasudeva Kutumbakam at the G20 summit, and India also assumed the G20 leadership on 1st of December 2022, and it will continue till November 2023. It also implies that nations of the world are a family, and we should ensure that every person in our own family should enjoy the same freedom. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching Tarun IAS. And if you like this, if you want to download the PDF of this session, you can go to the Telegram channel. The link will be given in the description below. Have a nice day.